The ship screamed as it fell through the atmosphere of Vylora 7, and Commander Velshara gripped her seat with all four of her hands as fire consumed the viewport in front of her face. She had been a warrior of the Keth-Eri Dominion for 40 cycles, and she had never known defeat like this one. The humans had come out of nowhere with their small, ugly ships and their primitive weapons, and somehow they had torn her cruiser apart in less than 10 minutes. The ground rushed up to meet her, and she braced herself for the impact that would surely end her life. But the emergency systems kicked in at the last moment, and the crash foam filled the cabin around her body like a protective shell. When she finally clawed her way out of the wreckage, she found herself in a jungle that stretched in every direction as far as her 3 eyes could see. The trees were massive things with bark the color of dried blood, and strange creatures called out from the shadows with voices that sounded almost like laughter. Her leg was broken below the knee and purple blood ran down her scaled skin in thin streams that left a trail behind her as she walked. Her plasma rifles were destroyed, and her communication array was nothing but melted slag. So she had no way to call for rescue and no way to defend herself except for the ceremonial blade that hung at her hip. The Keth-Eri were the greatest warriors in 3 star systems, and Velshara had killed more enemies than she could count. But right now, she was just a wounded soldier lost on a hostile world with nothing but a knife and her pride. She walked for what felt like hours through the thick undergrowth until she spotted something that made her stop and stare. There was smoke rising above the tree line about a kilometer to the east. And where there was smoke, there was fire. And where there was fire, there might be shelter and supplies. As she got closer, she realized that the smoke was coming from a small human settlement. Just a handful of prefabricated buildings arranged in a circle around a central courtyard. It looked like a research outpost of some kind, the type that humans like to scatter across every world. They touched like seeds thrown by a careless farmer. Velshara crouched behind a fallen tree and watched the settlement for any sign of movement. But the place seemed almost deserted. Perhaps the storm that had brought her ship down had driven the humans into hiding. Or perhaps they had fled when they saw the fireball of her crash streaking across the sky. She was about to move closer when she heard a sound behind her and spun around with her blade drawn, ready to kill whatever threat had found her. But it was not a threat that stood there in the shadows of the jungle. It was a human child. The boy was small, maybe 12 years old by human standards, with brown skin and dark hair that was messy and full of leaves. He wore simple clothes that were dirty and torn, and he carried a pack on his back that looked too big for his thin frame. Velshara had studied humans before she was sent to fight them, and she knew that their young were supposed to be weak and helpless creatures who depended on their parents for everything. This child should be screaming and running away at the sight of a 7-foot Keth-Eri warrior with blood on her scales and murder in her eyes. But the boy did not scream, and he did not run. He just stood there and looked at her with eyes that were calm and steady and showed no fear at all. "You are injured," the boy said in a voice that was quiet but clear, and Velshara was surprised to hear him speak in the common tongue that most species used for trade and diplomacy. "I am fine," she growled back at him, though the lie was obvious from the way she swayed on her broken leg. "No, you are not," the boy replied with a small shake of his head. "Your leg is fractured in at least 2 places, and you have lost a lot of blood. If you do not get treatment soon, you will die." Velshara stared at the child and felt something strange twist in her chest. How could this small, soft creature speak to her with such confidence when he should be trembling with terror? "What is your name, human child?" she demanded. "Marcus," he said simply. "What is yours?" She almost laughed at the absurdity of the question. Here she was, a commander of the Keth-Eri Dominion, being asked her name by a tiny human boy as if they were meeting at a social gathering. "I am Commander Velshara of the 3rd Fleet," she said with as much dignity as she could manage while leaning against a tree to keep from falling over. "Hello, Commander Velshara," Marcus said politely. "You should come with me. There is a cave nearby where we can shelter from the storm that is coming, and I have medical supplies in my pack." Velshara narrowed her eyes at the child and tried to understand what game he was playing. Did he not realize that she was his enemy? That her people and his people had been fighting a bloody war for almost a decade? "Why would you help me?" she asked with suspicion thick in her voice. Marcus shrugged his small shoulders and said, "Because you need help, and I can give it." That seems like a simple thing to me. The storm chose that moment to announce its arrival with a crack of thunder that shook the very ground beneath their feet. And Velshara looked up to see clouds the color of bruises rolling across the sky with terrifying speed. She made her decision quickly because she had no other choice. She could not survive the storm alone in her condition. And if this human child wanted to lead her into a trap, then she would simply have to kill him and anyone else who tried to harm her. "Very well," she said as she pushed herself away from the tree and limped toward the boy. "Lead the way, Marcus." The child nodded and turned to walk into the jungle without any hesitation. And Velshara followed behind him with her blade still in her hand and her 3 eyes, watching every shadow for signs of danger. She told herself that she was using the child as a guide and nothing more. That she would dispose of him once he had served his purpose, and she no longer needed his help. But even as she thought these things, some small part of her wondered why a human child would walk through a dangerous jungle without fear, and why he would offer help to an enemy soldier without asking for anything in return. The Cathari had always believed that humans were a weak species, soft and fragile and easy to break. They lived short lives, and their bodies were small, and their technology was primitive compared to the great civilizations of the galaxy. But as Velshara watched Marcus walk confidently through the jungle ahead of her, she felt the first tiny seed of doubt plant itself in her mind. Perhaps there was more to these humans than the Dominion had taught her to believe. The cave was deeper than Velshara had expected, and the walls were smooth and dark like the inside of some great beast's throat. Marcus had led her through the jungle for nearly an hour before they reached it, and by the time they stepped inside, the storm had already begun to tear at the trees with winds that howled like wounded animals. "We will be safe here," Marcus said as he dropped his pack on the ground and began to pull out supplies with the practiced movements of someone who had done this many times before. Velshara lowered herself to the ground with a grunt of pain and leaned her back against the cold stone wall. Her leg was throbbing with every beat of her heart, and her vision was starting to blur at the edges from blood loss. She watched the human child move around the cave with curious eyes and tried to understand what she was seeing. He set up a small light that filled the space with a soft glow. Then he spread out a thin blanket and arranged his medical supplies in neat rows, like a surgeon preparing for an operation. "Take off your armor so I can see your wounds," Marcus said in a voice that was calm and businesslike, as if treating injured alien warriors was something he did every day. "I do not need help from a human child," Velshara growled. But even as she said the words, she could feel her strength fading like water draining from a broken cup. Marcus looked at her with those steady dark eyes and said, "You will die if you do not let me help you. I have seen death before, and I know what it looks like. And right now it is sitting on your shoulder like a hungry bird waiting for its meal." The poetry of his words surprised her, and she found herself staring at this strange child, who spoke like someone much older than his years. "Where did you learn such things?" she asked. "My father," Marcus replied simply. "He was a Marine. He taught me everything I know about survival and medicine, and how to stay alive when the universe wants you dead." Velshara felt something cold move through her blood at the word Marine. She knew about the human Marines, The soldiers who had held the line at Karath Station against 10,000 Cathari warriors for 11 days without rest or retreat. She had always believed those stories were exaggerations. Thales made up by humans to make themselves feel less small in a galaxy full of species that were stronger and faster and older than they could ever hope to be. But looking at Marcus now, she was not so sure. "Fine," she said at last. And she began to remove her armor with trembling hands. Marcus moved toward her without fear and began to examine her wounds with careful fingers. She had deep cuts on her arms and chest from the crash, and her leg was swollen and twisted at an angle that made even her wince to look at it. "This will hurt," Marcus said as he pulled out a needle and thread from his kit. "But I need to close these cuts before you lose any more blood." Valshara had been tortured by enemies who wanted her secrets, and she had walked across burning sand with wounds that would have killed a lesser warrior. She was not afraid of pain, but when the needle pierced her flesh and the thread began to pull her torn skin together, she found herself gritting her teeth and digging her claws into the stone floor to keep from crying out. Marcus worked in silence, his small hands steady and sure as he stitched wound after wound with a skill that seemed impossible for someone so young. He did not flinch at the sight of her purple blood or the strange texture of her scaled skin. "How old are you?" Valshara asked when she could not stand the silence any longer. 12. Marcus answered without looking up from his work. "And you know how to do this?" She said with disbelief clear in her voice. "My father started teaching me when I was 6. Marcus explained. "He said that everyone should know how to take care of themselves and others. He said that knowledge is the best weapon because no one can ever take it away from you." Valshara thought about her own childhood, about the decades she had spent in the safety of the nursery ships, far from any danger or difficulty. Cathari children were protected and sheltered until they reached their second decade of life, kept away from anything that might harm them or teach them about the harsh realities of the universe. But here was this human child who had been learning to heal wounds and survive in the wilderness since he was barely old enough to walk. "Your sister," Valshara said, as she remembered something Marcus had mentioned earlier. "You said she can shoot better than you. How old is she?" 9. Marcus replied with a small smile that looked strange on his serious face. "She is really good. Dad says she has a natural talent for it. 9 years old and already training with weapons." Valshara felt the cold feeling in her blood grow stronger and spread to her bones. "Do all human children learn these things?" she asked. Marcus shrugged and said, "Most of the kids I know do. Our parents say that the universe is a dangerous place, and we need to be ready for anything." He finished the last stitch and tied it off with a neat knot. Then he turned his attention to her broken leg. She watched him examine the bone with his fingers and saw his face grow serious. "I can set this, but you will need to stay off it for at least a day," he said. "Do you want something for the pain?" "No," Valshara said firmly. "Cathari do not need such things." Marcus looked at her for a long moment, and then he nodded. He took hold of her leg with both hands and said, "Take a deep breath." Before she could respond, he twisted and pulled with a sudden sharp movement, and the bone snapped back into place with a sound like a branch breaking in the forest. Valshara heard herself scream, and the sound echoed off the cave walls like thunder. The pain was white and hot, and it filled her entire body for a moment that seemed to last forever. When her vision cleared, she saw Marcus wrapping her leg in a splint with quick, efficient movements. And she noticed that his hands were still steady, even though he had just caused her more pain than she had felt in years. "You did not warn me," she gasped. "Warning makes it worse," Marcus said simply. "If you tense up, the bone does not set properly. It is better to do it fast when you are not expecting it." Valshara stared at this child, who spoke about pain and bones and survival as easily as other children might speak about games and toys. and she felt her understanding of humans shift and change like sand moving in the wind. "Why are you not afraid of me?" she asked. Marcus looked up at her with those calm dark eyes and said, "Should I be?" "I am your enemy," Velshara replied. "My people have been killing your people for almost 10 years. I have killed humans myself, more than I can count. But you are not killing me now," Marcus pointed out, "and I am not killing you. Right now we are just two people trying to survive a storm. And that is enough." The simplicity of his logic struck her like a blow to the chest, and she found that she had no answer to give him. Outside the cave, the storm raged on with fury that shook the very ground beneath them. And inside, a wounded HFY warrior and a human child sat together in the soft glow of a small light. Velshara closed her 3 eyes and tried to rest, but sleep did not come easily. She kept thinking about what Marcus had said about his father and his sister and all the human children who learned to survive. Before they learned to play, the HFY had always called humans the soft species, the weak ones, the fragile creatures who would break and bow before the might of the Dominion. But now, Velshara was beginning to wonder if her people had made a terrible mistake. Dawn came to Valora 7 like a wound opening across the sky, and the clouds parted to reveal a sun that burned with pale orange light. The storm had passed during the night and left behind a jungle that was wet and steaming and full of strange sounds. Velshara woke from a restless sleep to find Marcus already awake and packing up his supplies with those same quick, efficient movements she had seen the night before. Her legs still throbbed with pain, but it was a dull, distant thing now, and she found that she could stand if she leaned against the cave wall for support. "We should move soon," Marcus said without looking at her. "The settlement is about 2 hours from here, and the others will be looking for me." "Others?" Velshara asked as she picked up her ceremonial blade and checked its edge with one claw. "My father and the other colonists," Marcus explained. "They will be worried. I was supposed to be back before the storm hit, but I got lost in the jungle." Velshara thought about this and felt a strange mixture of emotions move through her chest. Part of her wanted to use the boy as a hostage to ensure her own safety, to hold him as a bargaining chip until her fleet could send a rescue ship. But another part of her, a part that she did not fully understand, felt something like gratitude for this child who had saved her life without asking for anything in return. Before she could decide what to do, a sound from outside the cave made both of them freeze in place. It was a low clicking noise that echoed through the jungle like stones being struck together in a rhythm. That was almost like speech. Marcus went pale, and his eyes grew wide with what Velshara recognized as the first fear she had seen him show since they met Vrexal. He whispered. Velshara knew that name. The Vrexal were the apex predators of Valora 7, 6-legged hunting beasts with venomous claws and jaws that could crush bone like dry wood. Even the HFY had lost warriors to these creatures during their initial survey of the planet. "How many?" she asked as she gripped her blade and moved toward the mouth of the cave. Marcus listened for a moment and then held up 5 fingers. 5 of them, hunting together as a pack, drawn by the scent of her blood that she had left as a trail through the jungle yesterday. "Stay behind me," Velshara commanded. "If I fall, you must run as fast as you can and do not look back." She did not wait for his response. She stepped out of the cave and into the pale morning light with her blade raised and her 3 eyes scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. The first Vrexal came from her left, a blur of gray scales and snapping jaws that moved faster than anything that Sai should be able to move. Velshara swung her blade in a wide arc and felt it bite deep into the creature's neck, and hot green blood sprayed across her face as the beast collapsed at her feet. But she had no time to celebrate. The second Vrexal was already upon her, and she barely managed to twist out of the way as its venomous claws slashed through the air where her head had been a moment before her broken leg. screamed in protest as she tried to plant her feet and swing again. And the pain threw off her aim just enough that her blade only grazed the creature's side instead of cutting it in two. The Vrexall hissed and circled around her. And now she could see the other three emerging from the jungle with their dead black eyes fixed on her like she was already meat. Valshara had fought in 100 battles, and she had never known fear. But now she felt something cold grip her heart as she realized that she could not win this fight. She was wounded and weak and facing 5 predators that were born to kill. The second. Vrexall lunged and she met it with her blade. But as she stabbed forward, another one hit her from behind with the force of a crashing ship. She went down hard and felt her blade fly from her grip as she hit the ground. She saw the weapon spin through the air and land in the dirt near the mouth of the cave. And she saw Marcus standing there with wide eyes and trembling hands. "Run!" She screamed at him as the Vrexall pinned her to the ground with its massive weight. "Run now!" But Marcus did not run. Instead, he stepped forward and picked up the blade from the ground. And Valshara felt her heart stop in her chest at the sight. The ceremonial blade of a Kethari warrior was not just a weapon. It was bonded to their biology, designed to vibrate at frequencies that would tear through the nervous system of any species that touched it. A Kethari child would lose their hand if they tried to hold one, and humans were supposed to be even more fragile. "No!" Valshara shouted, "The blade will kill you." But as she watched with disbelief that shook the very foundations of everything she knew, Marcus wrapped his small human fingers around the handle and did not die. He did not scream, and he did not drop the weapon. He simply held it in both hands and turned to face the Vrexall that was now stalking toward him with hunger in its dead eyes. The blade hummed in his grip, and Valshara could see his hands shaking with the vibration. But somehow his soft human flesh did not tear, and his fragile human bones did not shatter. How? She gasped as she struggled against the beast that held her down, but there was no time for answers. The Vrexall leaped at Marcus with jaws open wide, and the boy moved in a way that Valshara had never seen a child move before. He did not freeze, and he did not stumble. He stepped to the side at the last moment and brought the blade up in a smooth arc that his father must have taught him. And the vibrating edge cut through the creature's throat like it was cutting through water. Green blood sprayed, and the Vrexall fell with a sound like thunder. And Marcus was already turning to face the next one with the blade raised and ready. Valshara used all 4 of her arms to push the beast off her chest and rolled to her feet with a roar of pain and fury. She had no weapon, but she still had her claws and her teeth and her rage. The remaining 3 Vrexall seemed confused by this turn of events. They had expected easy prey, and instead they had found a fight that was costing them dearly. One of them made the mistake of turning its back on Marcus to focus on Valshara, and the boy was on it in an instant. He drove the blade into its spine with a strength that seemed impossible for his small body, and the creature dropped without even a whimper. Valshara grabbed another Vrexall by its head and twisted with all the power she had left, and she felt its neck snap in her hands with a satisfying crack. The last one tried to flee, but Marcus threw the blade with an accuracy that made Valshara's 3 eyes go wide. The weapon spun through the air and buried itself in the creature's back, and it fell face first into the dirt and did not move again, and then it was over. The clearing was silent, except for the sound of heavy breathing and the drip of blood onto the ground. 5 Vrexall lay dead around them, and Marcus stood in the middle of it all, with his hands empty and his chest heaving. Valshara stared at the boy and saw that he was covered in blood, both green from the beast's and red from his own wounds. A claw had opened a deep cut on his shoulder, and venom was already spreading through his leg from where another had scratched him, but he was still standing. "You should have run," Valshara said in a voice that was barely more than a whisper. Marcus looked at her with eyes that were wild and scared, and full of something that she could not name. And he said, "You would have died." "I am your enemy," she reminded him. "You were," Marcus said. And then his legs gave out and he collapsed to the ground. Velshara moved to him as fast as her broken leg would allow and dropped to her knees beside him. She could see the venom spreading through his veins in dark lines that crept up his leg toward his heart. "Where's the anti-venom?" she demanded. Marcus reached for his pack with a shaking hand and pointed to one of the pockets. And Velshara tore it open and found a small injector that she pressed against his leg without hesitation. The boy cried out as the medicine entered his blood, and tears began to stream down his face as the shock of what he had just done finally caught up with him. But even as he cried, his hands were moving to the wound on his shoulder. He was already trying to treat himself, already trying to survive. Even as his body shook with fear and pain, Velshara watched this child who had picked up a blade that should have killed him and used it to save her life. And she felt something break apart inside her chest. She had believed that humans were weak. She had been so very wrong. The blood-soaked clearing was quiet now, and the only sounds were the distant calls of jungle birds, who had fled when the violence began and were now slowly returning to their perches. 5 dead Rexall lay scattered around like broken toys. And in the middle of it all sat a wounded HFY warrior and a human boy who should not still be alive. Velshara helped Marcus bandage the wound on his shoulder with strips of cloth from her own ruined uniform. And she watched his face as he gritted his teeth against the pain without making a sound. Tears still ran down his cheeks, but his hands remained steady as he helped guide her unfamiliar fingers through the process. "The blade," she said, when the silence became too heavy to bear. "How did you hold it without dying?" Marcus looked at her with tired eyes and took a moment to catch his breath before answering. The venom was still working its way through his system, even though the anti-venom had stopped its spread toward his heart. "I do not know what you mean," he said honestly. "It hurt to hold, but it did not feel like it would kill me." Velshara shook her head and tried to find words that would explain the impossible thing she had witnessed. The ceremonial blade of a HFY warrior was designed to be deadly to anyone who was not of their species. A failsafe to prevent enemies from using captured weapons against them. The blade vibrates at frequencies that destroy the nervous system of other species, she explained. Even a HFY child would lose their hand if they touched it before they were old enough. "You should have died in the first second." Marcus looked down at his hands and flexed his fingers, as if checking that they were still there. His palms were red and raw from the vibration, but the skin was unbroken and the bones beneath were whole. "Dad told me once that humans have a higher pain tolerance than most species," he said slowly. "He said that on our home world everything was trying to kill us all the time. And so we evolved to ignore pain when we need to. Maybe that is why the blade did not hurt me as much as it should have." Velshara stared at him and felt her understanding of the universe shift once again. She had been taught that humans were a young and primitive species who had only left their home world a few centuries ago. Barely a blink of an eye in the long history of the galaxy, but now she was starting to see them differently. "Tell me about your home world," she said. Marcus was quiet for a long moment as he watched the jungle around them with eyes that were still alert despite his exhaustion. Even now, wounded and poisoned and covered in blood, he was watching for danger. "Earth is beautiful," he said at last, "but it is also trying to kill you every single day. We have animals that can tear you apart with their teeth and claws, and plants that will poison you if you touch them, and weather that can destroy entire cities in the span of an hour." He paused and adjusted the bandage on his shoulder with a small wince of pain. "We have diseases that spread through the air and water and can wipe out millions of people in a few years," he continued. "We have earthquakes and volcanoes and floods and fires. And most dangerous of all, we have each other." Velshara felt a chill run through her blood that had nothing to do with her wounds. "Each other?" she asked. Marcus nodded and said, Humans have been fighting humans for as long as we have existed. We have killed more of our own kind than any other species has killed of us. And we have gotten very, very good at it over the centuries. He looked at her with those dark, steady eyes, and she saw something in them that she had seen before, in the eyes of the veterans who had survived the siege of Kareth Station. It was a look that said this person had seen the worst that the universe had to offer and had refused to break. My father says that humans are not the biggest, or the fastest, or the strongest species in the galaxy. Marcus said quietly, "We are not the smartest, or the oldest, or the most advanced, but we are the most stubborn." Stubborn? Valshara repeated the word like she was tasting it for the first time. "We do not know how to give up." Marcus explained, "When something tries to kill us, we do not run away. We fight back, and we keep fighting back. And we never stop until either we are dead or the thing that tried to kill us is dead instead." He looked down at his venom-blackened leg and at the blood that was soaking through his bandages. And then he looked back at her with a small smile that was almost apologetic. "You asked me why. I picked up the blade when you told me it would kill me," he said. "The answer is that I did not think about whether it would kill me. I just knew that you needed help, and I was the only one who could help, so I did what needed to be done." Valshara thought about her own people, about the way the Kethari fought and lived and died. They were warriors, yes, and they were strong and proud and fierce in battle. But they also knew when to retreat, when to surrender, when to accept defeat and live to fight another day. But looking at Marcus now, she realized that humans were not like that at all. "You would have died to save me," she said. "And it was not a question, maybe," Marcus admitted, "but I did not die. And now we are both alive, which is better than the alternative." He tried to stand, but his legs would not hold him, and he sat back down with a grunt of frustration. The venom was making him weak, even though it was no longer spreading. Valshara moved to his side and lifted him in her forearms as easily as she might lift a bundle of cloth. He was so light, so small, so fragile in her grip. And yet he had fought beside her like a warrior twice his size. "I will carry you back to your settlement," she said. Marcus looked up at her with surprise in his eyes and said, "You do not have to do that. I can walk if you just give me a few minutes." "No," Valshara said firmly. "You saved my life. This is the least I can do." She began to walk through the jungle with the human boy in her arms, and every step sent pain shooting up from her broken leg. But she ignored it the same way she had seen Marcus ignore his own pain as they walked. She thought about everything she had learned in the past day. She thought about a child who had been trained to survive since he was 6 years old. About a 9-year-old girl who could shoot better than her older brother. About a species that had spent its entire existence fighting against a world that wanted them dead. The Kethara had conquered 3 star systems through their strength and their skill in battle. They believed that they were the greatest warriors in the galaxy and that no other species could ever match them. But now Valshara understood something that her commanders and her admirals and her political leaders had never understood. Humans were not weak. They had never been weak. They had simply been patient, and now they were out among the stars, spreading to new worlds and new systems, raising their children to be survivors and fighters and the kind of people who would pick up a weapon that should kill them because someone else needed help. Valshara looked down at the boy in her arms and saw the future of the galaxy looking back at her. He was just a child, small and wounded and tired beyond measure. But there was something in his eyes that made her afraid in a way she had never been afraid before, not afraid of Marcus himself, but afraid of what his species might become if their children were like this. She thought, then what were their adults like? What were their soldiers like? Their generals, their leaders? What would happen when humanity finally stopped being patient? She did not have answers to these questions. But as she walked through the jungle toward the human settlement, she made a promise to herself that she would never underestimate. These people again, because Marcus had taught her something today that no amount of training or experience could have taught her. He had taught her that humans were not the soft species the Kethari believed them to be. They were something far more terrifying. They were the species that refused to die. The human settlement appeared through the trees like a vision from another world, and Valshara stopped at the edge of the jungle to stare at it with uncertain eyes. The prefabricated buildings looked so fragile and temporary compared to the great stone fortresses of the Kethari, and yet there was smoke rising from a central fire pit that spoke of warmth and life. Marcus stirred in her arms and lifted his head to look at his home. A small smile crossed his tired face, and he said, "We made it." Before Valshara could respond, a shout rang out from the settlement, and she saw humans running toward them with weapons raised. There were maybe a dozen of them, men and women in simple clothes carrying rifles that looked primitive but well-maintained. She tensed and prepared to put Marcus down so she could fight. But the boy reached up and touched her arm with one small hand. "It is okay," he said quietly. "They will not shoot if they see you are carrying me." He was right. As the humans got closer, they began to slow down, and their expressions changed from anger to confusion as they saw the wounded Kethari warrior holding their child in her forearms. One man pushed through the crowd and ran toward them faster than the others. He was tall and broad-shouldered with dark skin like Marcus and eyes that held the same steady calm that Valshara had come to recognize Marcus. The man shouted, and the fear in his voice was unmistakable. "I am okay, Dad," Marcus called back. "Just some scratches." The man reached them and stopped a few feet away, his rifle still in his hands but no longer pointed at Valshara. Up close, she could see the scars on his arms and face, the marks of a life spent in combat. This was the Marine, she realized. This was the father who had taught his son to survive. "Put him down," the man said in a voice that was calm but held an edge like a sharpened blade. Valshara lowered Marcus to the ground carefully, and the boy stumbled, but managed to stay on his feet long enough for his father to catch him. The man pulled his son into a fierce hug that lasted for several long seconds. When he let go, he looked at Valshara with eyes that saw everything, and she felt like she was being measured and weighed in a way that few had ever managed. "You brought him back," the man said, and it was not quite a question. "He saved my life," Valshara replied. "I merely returned the favor." The other colonists had gathered around him now, forming a loose circle that blocked any escape. Valshara could feel their hostility like heat from a fire, and she understood that she was at their mercy. But instead of ordering her execution, the man named David nodded slowly and lowered his rifle. "Come inside," he said. "You need medical attention and food. We can talk about what happens next after you have rested." Valshara stared at him and could not understand what was happening. She was a Kethari warrior, an enemy soldier who had crashed on their world and taken their child captive, and yet this man was offering her help and shelter. "Why?" she asked, unable to keep the confusion from her voice. David looked at Marcus and then back at Valshara, and there was something in his eyes that might have been amusement. "Because you kept my son alive," he said simply. "That is what matters." The colonists parted to let them through, and Valshara followed David and Marcus into the settlement with the feeling that she had stepped into a dream that made no sense. Humans moved around her with curious glances, but none of them tried to harm her. And she was led to a small medical building where her wounds were treated by a woman who asked no questions and showed no fear. She slept for nearly a full day, and when she woke, she found Marcus sitting beside her bed with a book in his lap. His own wounds had been properly treated, and his color had returned to normal. "How do you feel?" he asked, confused. Valshara admitted. Marcus smiled and said, "You will get used to it." Over the next 2 days, Valshara learned more about humans than she had learned in 40 cycles of fighting them. She watched the colonists work together to repair the damage from the storm. Saw parents teaching children and children helping parents. Witnessed arguments that ended in laughter and disagreements that were resolved with words. Instead of violence, she saw the way David looked at his son with pride and relief, and the way Marcus looked at his father with trust and admiration. She met the 9-year-old sister named Elena, who was indeed an excellent shot with a rifle, and who challenged Velshara to a target competition that the Kethari warrior somehow lost by 3 points on the third day. David brought her a small device that could contact her fleet. "Your people should know you are alive," he said. "We will not stop you from calling them." Velshara took the device and stared at it for a long moment. She could feel the weight of everything that had happened pressing down on her shoulders, and she knew that whatever she decided next would change the course of her life forever. "Why are you helping me?" she asked again. David sat down across from her and was quiet for a moment before answering. "Because that is who we are," he said. "We fight when we have to fight, and we kill when we have to kill. But when the fighting is over, we try to remember that our enemies are people too. If we lose that, we lose ourselves." He stood up and walked to the door, then paused and looked back at her with those steady eyes. "My son says you are not our enemy anymore," he said. "I trust his judgment. He's a good kid with good instincts." And then he was gone, and Velshara was alone with her thoughts and the small device in her hands. She made the call. A rescue ship arrived 6 hours later, and Velshara stood at the edge of the settlement as it descended from the sky. The colonists had gathered to watch, but none of them seemed afraid. And Marcus stood beside her with something in his hands that he had been hiding behind his back. "I want you to have this," he said. And he held out a small wooden figure carved in the shape of a person with 4 arms. Velshara took it and turned it over in her hands. The craftsmanship was simple but careful, and she could see the marks where a knife had shaped the wood with patient strokes. "My father made it," Marcus explained. "It is a tradition among humans. We give gifts to our friends to show that we care about them." "Friends?" The word struck Velshara like a blow, and she felt something shift in her chest that she could not name. "Thank you," she said. And the words felt strange in her mouth, but also true. The rescue ship landed and Kethari soldiers poured out with weapons raised. But Velshara held up a hand and they stopped. She walked toward them slowly and turned back one last time to look at the settlement and the humans, who had shown her something she had never expected to find. She saw Marcus standing with his father and his sister, and she raised one hand in a gesture of farewell. The boy raised his hand in return, and then she turned and walked onto the ship without looking back. On the journey home, her superiors asked her many questions about the human colony, about their defenses and their numbers and their weaknesses. They wanted intelligence that could be used to plan attacks and claim the planet for the Dominion. Velshara looked at the wooden figure in her hand and thought about Marcus picking up the blade that should have killed him, and about David offering help to an enemy soldier without hesitation, and about Elena challenging her to a shooting competition with laughter in her eyes. "There is nothing of strategic value there," she said. "The colony is too small and too well protected to be worth the cost of an assault." Her superiors accepted this without question, because she was a decorated commander and they had no reason to doubt her word. But later, alone in her quarters, Velshara opened her personal log and began to write. "I have seen something on that planet that changes everything I thought I knew," she wrote. "I have seen a human child pick up a weapon that should have destroyed him and use it to save the life of his enemy. I have seen humans fight with a fury that defies all logic and then offer kindness to those same enemies once the battle is done." She paused and looked at the wooden figure, at the 4 arms that the human child had carved to look like her own. "Do not mistake their kindness for weakness," she continued. "Do not mistake their small bodies for fragility. Do not mistake their children for helpless. They are patient and generous and warm, But when you push them too far, they become something else entirely. She thought about Marcus standing in the clearing with blood on his face and a blade in his hands. About the look in his eyes as he faced down creatures twice his size without flinching. I have seen what they are, she wrote, and I am afraid. Not of the humans who live today, but of the humans who will live tomorrow. If their children are like Marcus, then I do not want to know what they will become when they grow up. She saved the log and closed her eyes. And in her dreams she saw a galaxy where humans spread to every star and every world, raising their children to be survivors and fighters and the kind of people who would never stop and never give up and never surrender. She woke with a start and looked at the wooden figure in her hand. And she made a promise to herself that she would never forget, somewhere across the galaxy. A 12-year-old boy was holding a Kethari blade that Velshara had left behind for him. A warrior's gift from one fighter to another. And he was teaching his little sister how to hold it properly, showing her the same movements that his father had taught him, like this, Marcus said as he adjusted Elena's grip. Keep your wrist straight and let the blade do the work.